The council chamber was filled with voices from 100 different worlds, and each one spoke in their own way, but the translation systems made everything clear enough for all to understand. And at the center of this great hall sat Lyra, and she was not like the others because her kind were called elves, and they had come from a world where magic and nature lived together in harmony. And beside her throne was Shadowmere, and he was a dragon of great size with scales like polished black stone and eyes that glowed with golden fire, and together they had fought in many wars across the stars. The screen at the front of the chamber flickered one last time and then went dark, and the human ambassador had been speaking just moments before. But now there was only silence, and the transmission had ended, without warning and without explanation, and Lyra felt something cold move through her chest, because she knew what this meant, even if the others did not yet understand council chair. Vexthar stood up from his seat, and his insect-like body clicked and chittered as he moved, and he was old, even by his species standards, and he had seen many things in his long life, but today he looked worried, and his voice carried across the chamber when he spoke, and everyone stopped talking to listen to him. The humans have gone, and all their stations are dark, and all their colonies have shut down their communications, and all their ships have left our space, and they have withdrawn from the council completely, and they have taken everything with them. The chamber erupted into celebration, and the Cathari delegate was hissing with joy, and his reptilian face showed something like satisfaction, and the Morphean ambassador was glowing brighter than usual, and her crystalline body pulsed with different colors, and all around the room different species were celebrating because they had finally gotten rid of the humans, and for cycles they had argued with humanity about everything, and the humans had always wanted more military spending and more defense stations and more preparation for threats that might never come. Lyra did not celebrate, and she sat very still in her throne, and her hand rested on Shadowmere's neck, and through their bond she could feel what he felt. And he was uneasy, and dragons were old creatures, and they remembered things that younger species had forgotten, and Shadowmere had lived for 3,000 years, and he had seen civilizations rise and fall, and he knew the patterns that repeated through history. "This is wrong," and Lyra whispered the word so quietly that only Shadowmere could hear her, and the dragon rumbled deep in his chest, and the sound was too low for most species to hear. But Lyra felt it through their connection, and she knew he agreed with her. The Cathari delegate was speaking now, and his voice was full of triumph, and he was saying that finally the council could pursue peace without the humans, always pushing for war, and he said that humanity had been too aggressive and too quick to see threats where there were none, and he said that now they could focus on trade and culture and science instead of weapons and armies. Lyra had studied humanity during her time as an exchange officer on their world called Earth, and she had lived among them for 5 years, and she had learned their history and their ways, and what she learned had frightened her at first, but then she came to understand it. And humans were capable of great kindness and great cruelty, and they could create beautiful art and terrible weapons, and they could be patient for a very long time, but when they decided to act, they moved with terrible speed and purpose. She had watched human children playing in parks, and she had seen human artists creating works that moved her to tears, and she had eaten meals with human families and learned their customs and their jokes and their songs but she had also studied their wars, and their history was written in blood and conflict, and they had fought each other for thousands of years before they finally learned to work together, and even then they never forgot how to fight. And when they joined the Galactic Council, they brought that same intensity to everything they did. The Council had not understood this, and they saw human military readiness as aggression, and they saw human warnings as fear-mongering, and they saw human preparations as war-mongering, and so slowly over the years they had pushed humanity to the edges of council politics, and they had rejected human proposals, and ignored human concerns, and dismissed human intelligence reports. And now humanity had left, and Lyra knew this was not surrender. And when humans withdrew, it meant they had decided that something was not worth their time anymore, and they did not waste energy on lost causes. and they did not stay where they were not wanted. And throughout their history, when humans left a place or a conflict, it was because they had written it off completely. 3 days passed, and Lyra spent that time in her chambers, reviewing reports and studying star charts, and Shadowmere spent his time in dragon form, flying through the training halls and keeping his combat skills sharp, and they both felt the tension building, and they both knew something was coming, even if they did not know what form it would take. Then the alarms started screaming, and the first distress beacon came from a Kthari border colony, and the signal was garbled and full of static, but the words that came through were clear enough, and they spoke of ships that appeared from nowhere, and creatures that consumed everything, and a darkness that spread across their world. By the time Council Defense Forces arrived at the colony, there was nothing left, and the cities were gone, and the orbital stations were shattered, and the population of 6 million had simply vanished, and all that remained was debris floating in space, and a strange energy signature that the sensors could not properly identify. And it was something organic and wrong, and it made the scanning equipment malfunction. Within hours, more distress calls came in, and they came from different sectors and different species, territories, and each one told the same story, and something was attacking, and something was consuming, and something was spreading, and the colonies fell silent one by one, and no one who went to investigate came back with good news. Lyra was called to an emergency council session, and she arrived with Shadowmere in his smaller form, and even reduced in size. The dragon was still larger than most of the council members, and his presence made several delegates nervous, and they moved away when he passed and gave him space, because even the most peaceful species could recognize a predator when they saw one. The council chamber was in chaos, and everyone was shouting and trying to speak at once, and reports were flooding in faster than anyone could process them. And the death toll was climbing into the billions, and entire worlds were going dark, and the defense fleets that were sent to help were being destroyed or simply disappearing. Lyra waited for a pause in the shouting, and then she stood and her voice cut through the noise, and she said that she had a proposal, and the chamber fell silent, because everyone knew that Lyra was one of the few who had actually served in combat, and she had fought in the border wars, and she had experience that most council members lacked. We need to contact humanity and request their aid. And the words hung in the air like a physical weight. The chamber exploded with angry voices, and the Kthari delegate was shouting the loudest, and he said that they had driven humanity out for good reason, and that humans were too violent and too militaristic and too dangerous, and he said this even though his own species had lost 4 colonies already, and his people were dying in numbers that grew with each passing hour. Lyra let them shout, and she waited until they were tired, and then she spoke again, and her voice was cold and hard, and she said that humanity had warned them about this exact threat, and she said that the humans had presented evidence to the Council 50 times over the past 3 years, and 50 times the Council had voted down their proposals and called them paranoid and accused them of manufacturing threats. The threat was called the Void Swarm, and humanity had encountered it on the far edge of explored space, and they had fought it and barely survived, and they had come to the Council with warnings and data and tactical information, and the Council had ignored all of it, and now the swarm was here, and it was spreading faster than anyone had predicted, and it was consuming everything in its path. Council Chair Vexthar tried to restore order, and his voice was shaking now, and the confidence he had shown 3 days ago was gone. And he looked old and frightened, and he said that even if they wanted to contact humanity, they did not know where the humans had gone, and all human territory was under a complete communications blackout, and every probe they had sent into human space had been turned back, without explanation. Lyra looked at Shadowmere, and through their bond she felt his ancient wisdom flowing into her mind, and dragons remembered things that others forgot, and Shadowmere told her about patterns he had seen before, and about species that withdrew to prepare, and about the difference between retreat and strategic positioning. There is one human who might answer, And Lyra said this quietly, but everyone heard, and she explained that she had served with a human captain named Maya Brooks during the frontier survey missions. And they had been partners for 2 years, and they had saved each other's lives more than once, and Maya owed her a life debt by human custom, and if anyone would respond, it would be her. Then find her, and Vexthar commanded, and his voice cracked with desperation, and find her before the swarm consumes us all. Lyra bowed and turned to leave, and Shadowmere unfurled his wings, and even in the massive council chamber his wingspan was impressive, and it cast shadows across half the room, and several delegates backed away in fear, and as they left, Lyra could hear the council members already arguing about what they would offer humanity and what concessions they might make and what terms they could negotiate. Fools and Lyra said the word once they were outside, and Shadowmere rumbled agreement, and they still do not understand. They think humanity wants their apology, and that humans can be bargained with, and that this is a negotiation. But Lyra knew better, and she had lived among humans, and she understood how they thought. And humanity did not want council apologies, and humanity did not want council concessions, and humanity just wanted to be left alone, and that was all they had ever wanted. Lyra spent 6 hours preparing for the journey, and she gathered supplies and updated her ship systems and made sure everything was ready because the trip into human space would be dangerous and unpredictable, and no one had successfully entered human territory since they withdrew, and every attempt had been turned back by automated defenses, and some ships had simply vanished without trace. Shadowmere stayed close to her during the preparations, and he was restless and kept shifting between his smaller compact form and his true massive size. And this was unusual for him because normally he maintained perfect control, but the situation had him on edge, and dragons could sense things that other species could not, and whatever he sensed in the future troubled him deeply. The reports kept coming in while she worked, and each one was worse than the last. And 23 colonies had now fallen to the void swarm, and the death toll was in the tens of billions, and entire species were facing extinction, and the council defense fleets were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced, and every battle ended the same way, with the swarm consuming everything and leaving only empty husks behind. The swarm was not like other enemies, and it did not negotiate, and it did not take prisoners, and it did not want territory or resources in the traditional sense, and instead it consumed all biological matter and converted it into more swarm units, and it grew exponentially with each victory, and every fallen colony made it stronger and faster and more dangerous. Lyra remembered the briefings that Maya had given her during their time together on the frontier survey, and Maya had explained how the swarm worked and how it thought and how it spread, and the humans had encountered a small swarm cluster on the edge of known space, and they had barely managed to destroy it, and even that small cluster had cost humanity 3 ships and 2,000 lives. Maya had been frightened during those briefings, and Lyra had never seen her frightened before, because Maya was one of the bravest humans she had ever met, and if the swarm scared Maya, then it was truly terrifying. And Maya had tried to warn the council, and she had presented evidence and tactical data and projections, and the council had dismissed it all as human paranoia. Now the council was paying the price for that arrogance, and worlds were burning, and species were dying, and the swarm was spreading like a plague across council space, and there seemed to be no way to stop it, and conventional weapons were nearly useless because the swarm adapted too quickly and learned from each encounter. Lyra finished her preparations and climbed aboard her personal ship, and it was a small, fast vessel designed for exploration and diplomatic missions, and it was not a warship, but it was well shielded and had good sensors, and that would have to be enough. And Shadowmere flew alongside in his true form because he could travel through space naturally and did not need a ship. They left the council station and headed toward what had been the human border, and the journey would take several days, even at maximum speed. And Lyra used that time to review everything she knew about Maya and about human culture and about the best way to approach them. The space between council territory and human space was empty now, and it had once been busy with trade ships and diplomatic vessels and civilian traffic. But now there was nothing, and the shipping lanes were abandoned, and the trading posts were shut down, and even the pirates and smugglers had fled because no one wanted to be caught between the Council and whatever humanity was doing. As they traveled, Lyra saw more evidence of the swarm, and they passed through systems that had been attacked, and the devastation was total and complete, and orbital platforms were torn apart, and planetary surfaces were stripped bare, and nothing remained but dust and debris, and the strange energy signature that marked swarm presence. One system had been a thriving agricultural world, and it had fed 3 other colonies and supported a population of 8 million. And now it was a dead rock, and the atmosphere was gone, and the oceans were dried up, and the cities were crater-filled ruins, and Lyra felt sick looking at it, and Shadowmere roared in anger and grief. How did we not see this coming? And Lyra asked the question, even though she knew the answer. Through their bond, Shadowmere responded, and his thoughts were clear and sad, and he said that they did not see because they did not wish to see, and the Council had wanted to believe that the universe was safe and peaceful, and that threats could be negotiated away, and they had rejected anything that contradicted that belief. It took 6 days to reach the human border, and when they arrived, Lyra was shocked by what she found, and there was a defensive perimeter that surrounded the entire human sector, and it was massive and complex, and included weapons satellites and minefields and energy barriers and sensor nets and things she could not even identify. The defenses were not just physical, and Shadowmere growled as they approached, and through their bond, Lyra felt what he felt, and there was something else protecting human space, and it was technological and psionic and magical. All at once, and it was a wall designed to keep everyone out, and it would kill anything that tried to force its way through. Lyra brought her ship to a stop at the edge of the perimeter, and she opened a communication channel and broadcast on the old Frontier Survey frequency. And it was a secure channel that only survey veterans would know, and she hoped Maya still monitored it. "This is Lyra of House Silvermoon, calling Captain Maya Brooks, and I invoke the debt of blood and fire, and I need your help." The words blood and fire were important, and they referred to a specific incident during their survey mission, and Maya had been trapped in a burning station, and Lyra had risked her life to pull her out, and later Lyra had been poisoned by an alien plant, and Maya had donated her own blood for the transfusion that saved her life, and they had sworn oaths to each other that night and promised to answer if the other ever called. Silence stretched across the void, and seconds became minutes, and Lyra began to wonder if Maya was even alive, and if she was still in human space, and if she would even remember or care about an oath made years ago when things were different. Then the communication channel crackled to life, and a voice came through, and it was older than Lyra remembered, and wearier and harder. But it was definitely Maya Lyra, and figured you might show up eventually and come to ask us to save you from the mess we warned you about. There was no anger in the voice, and no satisfaction, and just a tired acceptance of something Maya had seen coming for a long time. And Lyra felt shame burning in her chest because Maya was right, and they had ignored the warnings, and now they were begging for help. Yes, and Lyra said the word simply because there was no point in denying it and no point in making excuses, and Maya would see through any attempt at deception. There was a longer pause, and Lyra could almost hear Maya thinking and calculating and deciding whether humanity should even bother helping the species that had rejected them and driven them away. And she waited and hoped that the bond they had formed during their service together still meant something. Coordinates incoming, and Maya finally said, and follow them exactly. And Shadowmere's energy signature has been cleared for entry, and if you deviate even slightly, the automated defenses will destroy you, and there will be no warnings. Data appeared on Lyra's navigation screen, and she studied the course, and it was complex and winding and clearly designed to lead her through the only safe path in the defensive perimeter, and one wrong move would trigger the weapons, and she would be vaporized instantly. She acknowledged the coordinates and began following the path, and Shadowmere flew alongside, and the dragon was tense and alert because he could sense the weapons tracking them and calculating firing solutions and waiting for any excuse to attack. The barrier opened ahead of them, and it looked like a wound in space itself, and reality seemed to bend and twist around the edges, and Lyra guided her ship through carefully, and Shadowmere followed, and for a moment, everything went dark and silent, and she felt like she was falling through nothing. Then they were through, and what Lyra saw on the other side made her breath catch in her throat, and her hands froze on the controls. And beside her ship, Shadowmere roared in surprise and awe. Humanity had not retreated in defeat, and they had not fled in fear, and they had not abandoned the galaxy, and instead they had withdrawn to prepare, and what they had prepared was terrifying and magnificent, and spoke of a species that understood war in ways the Council never would. There were dozens of worlds ahead, and each one was fortified beyond anything Lyra had ever seen, and massive defense platforms orbited each planet, and weapon emplacements covered every surface, and shield generators created overlapping fields of protection, and everything was designed for one purpose, which was to make these worlds impossible to conquer. Battle fleets filled the space between worlds, and they were not the small patrol groups that Council species maintained, and these were proper war fleets and hundreds of ships organized into tactical formations, and each ship was larger and more heavily armed than anything in Council space, and they moved with practiced precision that spoke of constant drilling and training. Orbital construction yards surrounded 3 different moons, and they were building more ships, and the pace of construction was incredible, and Lyra could see dozens of vessels in various stages of completion, and automated systems, and human workers and robotic assistants all working together, and new ships were being completed every few days. There were things Lyra did not recognize, and strange platforms that hummed with power, and weapons that looked like they could crack planets, and sensor arrays that probably could detect a ship on the other side of the galaxy. And humanity had spent their time in isolation, building an arsenal that could challenge the entire Council combined. A message came through directing her to land on a station called Sentinel Prime, and it was the largest structure in the system, and bigger than some moons, and covered in weapons and sensors and docking ports, and thousands of ships moved around it in organized patterns. Lyra followed the instructions and landed in a designated bay, and Shadowmere landed beside her ship and returned to his smaller form, and together they walked through corridors that were clean and efficient, and designed for function rather than beauty, and human crew members moved past them with purpose and discipline. Captain Maya Brooks was waiting for them in an observation deck, and she stood looking out at the construction yards and the battle fleets, and she did not turn when Lyra entered, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Maya was older now, and her dark hair had streaks of gray, and there was a scar running down her left cheek that had not been there before, and she stood with the posture of someone who carried heavy burdens and had learned to bear them without complaint. Finally, Maya turned, and her brown eyes were harder than Lyra remembered, and colder, and something in them had changed during the years since they last met, and Lyra realized that Maya had seen things and done things that had altered her in fundamental ways. "Welcome to the result of Council wisdom," and Maya said, and her voice carried bitter amusement. "And this is what happens when you force the warriors to leave, and we go away, and we prepare, and we build, and we become something you will fear more than any external threat." Maya led them through the observation deck and past windows that showed the scale of human preparations, and Lyra could not stop looking at the massive fleets and the construction yards and the weapons that humanity had built during their isolation, and it was overwhelming and frightening and impressive all at once. They walked in silence for a while, and human crew members saluted Maya as she passed, and their movements were crisp and professional, and this was clearly a military operation, and not the loose diplomatic structure that the Council preferred, and everyone here had a purpose and a role, and they executed their duties with precision. Shadowmere walked beside Lyra, and his claws clicked on the metal floor, and some crew members gave the dragon nervous looks, but most simply nodded respectfully and moved on, and they had clearly been briefed about his presence, and knew he was not a threat, and this level of preparation and communication impressed Lyra because it spoke of discipline and organization. Maya finally stopped at a conference room and gestured for them to enter, and the room was simple and functional with a large table and several screens showing tactical data and star charts and fleet positions, and there was no decoration and no attempt to make the space comfortable or welcoming, and it was purely a workspace. Sit, and Maya said, and she moved to a console and began pulling up information, and Lyra sat at the table, and Shadowmere coiled beside her chair and watched everything with those ancient golden eyes that missed nothing. The council is being destroyed, and Lyra said quietly, and 23 colonies lost and billions dead, and the void swarm is spreading faster than anyone predicted, and our defense fleets cannot stop it, and conventional weapons are nearly useless, and we need help than we predicted 3 years ago. And Maya finished the sentence without looking up, and yes, we know, and we have been tracking the swarm since it entered council space, and we have detailed information on its movements and its tactics and its biology, and we know exactly how bad things are. She brought up a holographic display, and it showed council space, and red markers indicated swarm locations, and the red was spreading like an infection, and Lyra felt sick looking at it, because the projection showed the swarm consuming half of council space within 6 months, if nothing changed. We tried to warn you, and Maya said, and her voice was flat and emotionless. And 50 times we brought evidence to the council, and 50 times you voted us down and called us paranoid and accused us of manufacturing threats to justify our military, and some delegates claimed we were trying to stage a coup, and others said we wanted to militarize the council and turn it into a human empire. Lyra remembered those sessions, and she had voted with humanity most of the time, but not always, and there had been moments when she too had wondered if the humans were exaggerating the threat, and if their military culture was making them see dangers that did not exist. And now she knew the truth, and the shame of that doubt burned inside her. We were wrong, and Lyra admitted, and we were fools and cowards, and we wanted the galaxy to be safe and peaceful, and we refused to accept that there were threats that could not be negotiated with or reasoned with, and we punished you for telling us the truth. Maya finally looked at her, and there was no satisfaction in her expression and no triumph, and just a tired sadness, and she had clearly hoped they would listen and clearly known they would not, and now she was watching people die because of choices made years ago. "Will you help us?" and Lyra asked, and she kept her voice steady even though fear was clawing at her chest. "That depends," and Maya replied, "and what is the council offering? Anything?" And Lyra said immediately, and technology and resources and territory and trade agreements and seats on the High Council, and whatever you want, I do not want your territory. And Maya said, and she turned back to the holographic display, and I do not want council seats, and I do not want trade agreements, and I do not want any of the things you think we want. "Then what?" and Lyra asked, and confusion mixing with desperation. Maya was quiet for a long moment, and she stared at the display showing council space being consumed by the swarm, and when she spoke her words were careful and measured and clearly something she had thought about extensively. "Here is what will happen, and humanity will help you, and we will push back the swarm, and we will save what is left of the council species, and we will stop the immediate threat, and in return, humanity withdraws permanently from all council affairs, and you leave us alone, and no contact, and no diplomacy, and no council oversight, and no observers, and no trade delegations, and nothing." Lyra stared at her. And that is isolation and complete isolation. That is survival, and Maya corrected, and for both of us. And you need to understand something, Lyra, and we did not leave, because we were afraid of the swarm, and we left because we were tired of protecting people who hated us for protecting them, and tired of being called warmongers and aggressors and monsters, and tired of having our warnings ignored and our advice rejected and our sacrifices dismissed. And Lyra started to say no buts. And Maya interrupted, and her voice was hard now. And this is not a negotiation, and these are our terms. And you either accept them, or you go back to the council and tell them they are on their own. And we will stay here behind our defenses and watch while the swarm consumes you. And then we will destroy whatever is left of the swarm when it finally reaches our borders, and either way, humanity survives. Through her bond with Shadowmere, Lyra felt the dragon's agreement, and he understood what Maya was saying because he had lived through similar situations across his long life, and he had seen civilizations reject their protectors and then beg for help when threats emerged, and the pattern was always the same. "You have become cold," and Lyra said softly, "and the Maya I knew would not abandon people to die. The Maya you knew still exists," and Maya replied, and she still cares and still wants to help. But she learned that caring is not enough, and that help is meaningless if it is resented, and that protection breeds contempt, and the galaxy does not want protectors, and it wants the illusion of safety without the reality of defense. She walked to the window and looked out at the battle fleets, and her reflection was visible in the glass, and she looked tired and older than her years. And Lyra realized that commanding these forces and making these decisions and bearing the responsibility for human survival had cost Maya something essential. "We will help you, because it is the right thing to do," and Maya continued. And because the swarm is a threat to all life, and because letting billions die would make us the monsters you always claimed we were, but we will not be your shields anymore, and we will not be your convenient warriors, and we will not be the violence you need, but refuse to acknowledge. What if another threat emerges in the future? And Lyra asked, and something worse than the swarm. "Then you will have to face it yourselves," and Maya said without hesitation. "Or you will die trying. And those are your only options now, and humanity is done being responsible for the galaxy's survival while being blamed for the galaxy's problems." The words hung in the air between them, and Lyra knew this was not anger or revenge, and this was simply the logical conclusion of years of rejection and dismissal, and humanity had tried to work within the council system, and the council had made it clear that human methods and human values were not welcome. Shadowmere rumbled, and the sound drew both their attention, and the dragon spoke directly into their minds, and his ancient voice carried weight and wisdom. The elf rider speaks truth when she says you have become cold, but this is not weakness, and this is the coldness of steel that has been tempered in fire and forged into something stronger. And the council did this to you, and they demanded you be soft. And when you could not be soft, they demanded you leave, and now they discover that soft civilizations do not survive hard times. Maya looked at the dragon with something like respect, and Shadowmere was one of the few beings in the galaxy who could understand what humanity had become and what they had sacrificed and what they had gained through their isolation. "How long will it take to mobilize your forces?" And Lyra asked, and accepting that the terms were not negotiable. "We have been mobilized since the day we withdrew." And Maya said, "And we expected this, and we prepared for this, and we can deploy within 24 hours. And the question is not whether we are ready, and the question is whether the council is ready to see what we have become." "What do you mean?" And Lyra felt a chill run down her spine. Maya pulled up another display, and it showed tactical plans and battle strategies and weapon specifications, and everything was detailed and precise and clearly the result of years of planning and preparation. "We are going to save you," and Maya said, and we are going to destroy the swarm. But the methods we use will horrify you, and we will employ tactics that the council banned decades ago, and we will use weapons that violate treaties, and we will make choices that will sicken the peaceful species who never wanted to acknowledge that such choices might be necessary. Lyra understood what she was saying, and the council had many rules about warfare and about acceptable methods and about proportional responses and about civilian protection and about environmental preservation, and humanity was saying they would ignore all of it. People will die. And Lyra said billions are already dying, and Maya countered, and our methods will save more lives than they cost, but the council will not see it that way. And they will see human forces using scorched earth tactics and biological weapons and calculated sacrifices, and they will remember why they drove us out, and they will be grateful for our help and horrified by our methods, and that is why we are demanding permanent separation. She turned to face Lyra directly, and her eyes were intense and serious. You need to understand what you are asking for, and when you call humanity to war, you are calling monsters and not heroes. And we will do what is necessary and not what is right, and we will make the hard choices that you refuse to make. And we will bear the moral weight of those choices, but we will not apologize for them, and we will not be judged for them, and we will not be punished for them. And if the council cannot accept that, then they should not call us. Shadowmere spoke again, and his thoughts were grave. This is the price of peace, and someone must be willing to do the dark things so that others can remain in the light, and someone must be willing to carry the burden of necessary evil so that others can maintain their innocence, and humanity has chosen to be that someone. But they will no longer pretend it is anything other than what it is Lyra thought about the council, and about the delegates who celebrated human departure, and about the species who wanted safety without sacrifice, and about civilizations that demanded protection while condemning protectors. And she knew Maya was right, and knew the council would never accept what humanity had become. I will take your terms to the council, and Lyra said finally, and I will tell them the truth, and I will recommend they accept, but I cannot guarantee they will listen. They will listen. And Maya said with certainty, and because the alternative is extinction, and even the most stubborn species develop clarity when facing annihilation. She extended her hand in the human gesture of agreement, and Lyra took it, and their grip was firm, and both knew they were sealing something more than just a military alliance, and they were acknowledging a fundamental truth about the galaxy, and about the nature of survival, and about the price of civilization. Prepare to deploy, and Maya said, and turning to a communications console, and all fleet commanders, and full mobilization and target is the void swarm in council space, and rules of engagement are total war and no restrictions. The orders went out across human space, and thousands of ships began preparations, and millions of personnel moved to battle stations, and the great machine that humanity had built during their isolation began to move toward war. The journey back to council space took 4 days, and Lyra spent that time preparing her report and thinking about how to present humanity's terms in a way that the council might accept. And it would not be easy because the terms were harsh and uncompromising, and the council was not accustomed to being dictated. To Shadowmere flew alongside her ship, and through their bond she could feel his thoughts. And the dragon was troubled by what they had seen, and he had lived long enough to recognize patterns in history, and he had seen this story before. And it never ended well for the soft civilizations who rejected their warriors. More colonies fell while she traveled, and the swarm continued spreading, and the death toll climbed past 30 billion, and entire species were facing extinction, and the council defense fleets were being systematically destroyed, and panic was spreading through the remaining territories. When Lyra arrived at the council station, she was immediately summoned to an emergency session, and the chamber was in chaos, and delegates were shouting and arguing and accusing each other, and the fear was palpable, and everyone knew they were losing, and no one knew how to stop it. Council Chair Vexthar called for order, and his voice was desperate and strained, and he looked like he had not slept in days, and when he spoke to Lyra there was naked hope in his eyes. Did you find them and will they help? Yes. And Lyra said, and they will help. But there are conditions. The chamber fell silent, and every delegate leaned forward and waiting to hear what humanity wanted, and already calculating what they might be willing to give. Humanity will deploy their forces against the Void Swarm, and Lyra began, and they will use all available resources to push back the threat and save what remains of Council space, and in return they demand complete and permanent separation from the Council. What does that mean? And the Cathari delegate asked, and his voice was suspicious. It means no contact, and Lyra explained, and no diplomacy, and no trade, and no observers, and no council oversight, and no interaction of any kind, and humanity will exist in their own space, and we will exist in ours, and never shall the two meet again. That is isolation, and the Morphean ambassador said, and her crystalline form pulsed with agitation. That is survival. And Lyra echoed Maya's words, and for both species and humanity has concluded that coexistence is not possible, and that our values are too different, and our methods too incompatible, and they are willing to help us one final time, but then they want to be left alone forever. The chamber erupted in debate, and some delegates were outraged at the terms, and others were relieved that humanity was willing to help at all. And still others were calculating whether the Council could defeat the swarm without human assistance, and coming to the grim conclusion that they could not. We should negotiate better terms, and the Cathari delegate insisted, and we should not accept such harsh conditions, and we have things they want, and we have leverage. No. And Lyra said flatly, and we have no leverage, and we are losing this war, and billions are dead, and more die every day, and humanity knows this, and their terms are not negotiable. And we either accept or we face the swarm alone. But we could offer them technology, and someone suggested, and/or access to rare resources and/or strategic territory. They do not want our technology. And Lyra replied, and they do not want our resources, and they do not want our territory, and they want something we are very bad at giving, and they want to be left alone. And they want to exist without being judged and condemned and blamed for being what they are. And what are they? And Vexthar asked quietly. Warriors, and Lyra said, and they are warriors in a way that we are not. And they understand violence and death and sacrifice in ways that make us uncomfortable, and they are willing to do things we consider immoral to achieve victory, and they are tired of being hated for keeping us safe. Shadowmere rumbled and spoke aloud, and his voice filled the chamber and startled several delegates who had forgotten he was there. I have seen this pattern many times across the centuries, and soft civilizations create hard warriors to protect them, and then the soft ones grow to resent the hard ones, and they drive them away or chain them with rules and restrictions, and then when threats emerge, the soft ones die because they cannot defend themselves, and the hard ones survive because they never forgot how the dragon looked around the chamber and his golden eyes saw through all the posturing and politics. You have a choice now, and accept humanity's terms and live and/or reject them and die, and there is no third option, and there is no negotiation, and there is no middle ground. And this is the consequence of your earlier choices when you decided you did not want warriors among you. The truth of his words hung heavy in the air, and no one could deny it. And the Council had spent years pushing humanity away and rejecting their advice and dismissing their warnings. And now they face the results of those decisions. There is something else. You should know, and Lyra said, and humanity will save us, but their methods will be brutal, and they will use tactics and weapons that violate our treaties and our ethics and our sense of morality, and you will be horrified by what they do even as you benefit from it. What kind of methods? And someone asked nervously. Maya told me, they will use scorched earth tactics, and Lyra explained, and biological weapons designed specifically to target the swarm, and calculated sacrifices where they trade thousands of lives to save millions, and weapons that can crack planets, and strategies that accept massive collateral damage in exchange for victory. The chamber was silent, and several delegates looked sick, and they were peaceful species who had not fought wars in generations, and who believed that violence was always wrong, and that there were always alternatives, and now they were being told that their survival required embracing everything they had rejected. "We cannot accept such methods," and the Morphean ambassador said, and her voice shook. "And we have laws and principles and ethics that forbid such brutality. Then you will die." And Lyra said bluntly, and your laws and principles and ethics will die with you. And the swarm does not care about morality, and it only cares about consuming. And if you are not willing to do whatever is necessary to stop it, then you are already dead. She pulled up the holographic display showing the swarm's advance, and the projections were clear. And without intervention, Council space would be completely overrun within 8 months, and every species in the chamber was facing extinction. This is the price, and Lyra continued, and someone must be willing to do the dark things, and someone must be willing to bear the moral weight of necessary evil, and someone must be willing to sacrifice their conscience for the survival of others. And humanity has volunteered to be that someone, and but only if you leave them alone afterward. Why do they want separation? And Vextar asked, and why not rejoin the council after the war? Because they know you will hate them for what they are about to do. And Maya had been very clear about this, and they know you will see human forces destroying swarm hives and using weapons you consider immoral and making choices you consider evil, and they know you will remember why you drove them out, and they do not want to spend the next century being condemned for saving you. The debate continued for hours, and delegates argued and pleaded and tried to find alternatives, but there were no alternatives, and the swarm was spreading and time was running out, and eventually even the most idealistic delegates had to face reality. Finally, Vextar called for a vote, and the measure was simple, and accept humanity's terms or reject them and face the swarm alone, and the vote was not unanimous, and several delegates voted against, but the majority accepted because survival outweighed pride. Lyra was authorized to contact humanity and accept their terms, and she left the chamber immediately, and Shadowmere followed, and both felt the weight of what had just happened, and they had just sealed the fate of 2 civilizations, and ensured that humanity and the Council would never interact again. She sent the message from her ship, and Maya responded within minutes, and the human fleets were already in motion, and they had been preparing since Lyra left. And they knew the Council would accept because there was no other choice. The first human forces arrived at the front lines within 36 hours, and Lyra was there to observe, and she had requested permission to accompany the fleet. And Maya had granted it because she wanted Lyra to see and to understand, and to be able to explain to the Council what humanity had become. What Lyra witnessed in the following days would stay with her forever and haunt her dreams and change how she viewed war and peace and survival and morality. The human fleet arrived at a swarm-infested system and did not hesitate, and did not pause to assess, and did not try to minimize damage, and they simply attacked with overwhelming force and brutal efficiency. Weapons that the Council had banned decades ago lit up the darkness, and biological agents designed to disrupt the swarm's hive mind spread through their clusters, and ships deliberately rammed swarm vessels when it was tactically advantageous, and entire planets were sterilized when they became too infested to save Lyra, watched as a human commander ordered the evacuation of a colony world and then destroyed it, and she watched as 3,000 colonists died because the shuttles could not reach them in time, and she watched as the commander made that choice without hesitation, and because saving those 3,000 would have cost 30,000 more. She watched as human forces used civilians as bait and drawing swarm units into kill zones, and she watched as they released biological weapons that killed everything in a 10-kilometer radius, and swarm and non-swarm alike, and she watched as they made decision after decision that Council doctrine would consider war crimes. But she also watched as those decisions worked, and watched as the swarm advance slowed and stopped and then reversed. and watched as human forces systematically destroyed hive after hive and cluster after cluster, and she watched as billions of lives were saved by methods that made her stomach turn. Maya was right, and Shadowmere said through their bond, and someone must be willing to do these things, and humanity has chosen to bear that burden. And this is what warriors look like when they stop pretending to be anything else. The campaign lasted 3 months, and it was brutal, and efficient, and effective, and human forces pushed the swarm back system by system and world by world, and they did it by being more ruthless and more adaptable and more willing to sacrifice than the swarm itself. Council observers watched in horror and fascination, and they documented everything and recorded every decision and every tactic and every weapon, and they would spend years analyzing what they saw and trying to reconcile the fact that these brutal methods had saved them. Lyra spent most of that time on Maya's flagship and watching the war unfold and learning things about warfare that the Council had deliberately forgotten, and she saw human soldiers cry for the choices they made, and saw commanders bear the weight of decisions that would haunt them forever, and saw a species that understood the cost of survival. "This is what you rejected," and Maya told her one night, and as they watched another battle unfold, "And this is what you could not accept, and we are not heroes, and we are not villains, and we are simply willing to do what must be done, and the galaxy needs people like us, but it can never love us for it." Lyra had no response, and because she knew Maya was right, and knew the Council would never accept humanity back, and knew that separation was the only way forward. The final battle took place in the Outer Rim, where the swarm had first entered Council space, and human forces had driven the enemy back to their original entry point. And now they prepared to destroy what remained and ensure the threat would not return. Lyra stood on the bridge of Maya's flagship, and Shadowmere was coiled beside the command chair in his full majestic form, and even the battle-hardened human crew gave the dragon respectful distance, and they had learned that Shadowmere was ancient and powerful and wise beyond mortal understanding. The swarm had gathered its remaining forces for one final stand, and millions of bioships clustered around the dimensional rift they had used to enter this galaxy, and they were desperate and cornered and more dangerous than ever. All ships and Maya commanded, and her voice was steady and calm, and assault pattern Omega, and target the rift generators, and no retreat and no surrender. The human fleet moved forward as one, and thousands of ships advancing in perfect formation, and they had practiced this maneuver countless times, and every captain and every crew member knew their role, and they executed with precision that came from discipline and training. What followed was less a battle and more an execution, and human weapons tore through swarm defenses and carved paths through their bioships and created corridors of destruction that led straight to the rift, and nothing the swarm did could stop them. Lyra watched as human forces employed every tactic they had learned over 3 months of fighting, and they used the swarm's own biology against it and exploited weaknesses they had discovered and adapted faster than the enemy could counter, and it was beautiful and terrible to witness. The swarm tried to flee back through the rift, but human forces had anticipated this, and weapon platforms surrounded the dimensional tear, and anything that tried to escape was destroyed, and the swarm was trapped and doomed. And they knew it. Maya watched the battle with no expression, and her face was carved from stone, and Lyra knew she was thinking about the cost, and about the lives lost, and about the choices made, and about the burden that humanity would carry forever. "How many?" and Lyra asked quietly, and knowing Maya would understand human casualties, and Maya replied, "And 8,000 dead and 23,000 wounded, and acceptable losses considering the scale of the operation, acceptable." And Lyra repeated, and the word tasted wrong in her mouth. "Yes," and Maya said, and acceptable, because those 8,000 saved billions, and acceptable, because their sacrifice ensured the swarm would never threaten this galaxy again, and acceptable because they chose to be here. And they knew the risks, and they died as warriors. The rift began to collapse as human weapons destabilized its structure, and the remaining swarm ships were caught in the implosion and crushed and destroyed. And within minutes, nothing remained but debris and fading energy signatures. "It is done," and Maya announced, "and all ships and begin recovery operations and salvage. What can be salvaged and honor the fallen and prepare for departure." The fleet began its work, and rescue ships moved to recover escape pods, and engineering teams assessed damage, and medical teams treated the wounded, and everyone moved with purpose and efficiency, and there was no celebration and no joy, and just grim satisfaction that the job was complete. Council observers had witnessed everything, and they transmitted reports back to their governments, and described the brutality and the efficiency and the terrible effectiveness of human warfare, and the council would debate these reports for years and never reach consensus on what they meant. 3 days later, the ceremony took place, and it was held in neutral space between council territory and human space, and representatives from both sides gathered to formally conclude the agreement. Council Chair Vexthar led the council delegation, and he looked older than when Lyra had last seen him, and the war had aged everyone and showed them things they could not unsee and taught them truths they could not unlearn. Maya led the human delegation, and she wore her military uniform and carried herself with the bearing of someone who had just won a war, and behind her stood officers who had commanded the fleets and made the hard choices and borne the weight of necessary evil. The ceremony was brief and formal, and there were no speeches and no celebrations, and just the signing of documents that formalized the separation, and both sides knew this was an ending and not a beginning. Humanity has fulfilled its obligations. And Maya said, and the void swarm has been eliminated from council space, and the threat is neutralized, and our forces will now withdraw. And as agreed, we expect no further contact. The council thanks you for your service." And Vexthar replied, and his voice was stiff and formal, and we acknowledge the debt we owe, and we will honor the terms of our agreement. There was no warmth in the exchange, and no friendship, and just the cold transaction of obligation fulfilled and payment rendered. And both sides were satisfied with this, because neither wanted anything more. As the delegations prepared to depart, Vexthar tried one final time, and perhaps in the future, and when enough time has passed, and we might reconsider, and we might find a way to coexist. Maya looked at him with something like pity. "And no, and we will not reconsider, and time will not change what we are or what you need us to be. And you want protectors who do not make you uncomfortable, and we cannot be that, and we will not pretend to be that. And this separation is permanent." She turned to leave and then paused. "And one more thing, and if another threat emerges and something worse than the swarm, and you are on your own, and we have given you the tools, and the knowledge, and the example, and if you cannot defend yourselves, then you do not deserve to survive." The words were harsh and final, and they left no room for hope or negotiation, and the human delegation departed, and their ships disappeared into the distance, and heading back to their isolated territory. Lyra watched them go and felt something break inside her, and she had served with those people and fought beside them and shared meals and stories and laughter, and now they were leaving forever, and she would never see them again. Through her bond, Shadowmere felt her pain, and the dragon sent comfort and understanding. "They are not abandoning you," and he said gently, "and they are choosing themselves, and there is a difference, and you cannot save people who do not wish to be saved, and you cannot protect people who hate you for protecting them." "I know," and Lyra whispered, but it still hurts." The dragon was quiet for a moment, and then spoke with the weight of 3,000 years of experience. "I have watched this story unfold many times across the centuries, and the strong protect the weak, and the weak grow to resent the strong, and they drive them away, or try to control them, and then when new threats emerge, the weak cry out for help, and the strong must decide whether to answer. And what do the strong usually choose?" And Lyra asked, "They choose themselves." And Shadowmere said, and because eventually even the strongest grow tired of being hated for their strength and used for their power and discarded when convenient, and humanity has reached that point, and they have learned the lesson that all warriors eventually learn. What lesson? That you cannot save people from themselves, and that some civilizations are meant to fall, and that survival belongs to those willing to fight for it, and not those who expect others to fight for them. Lyra looked at the council delegation, and they were already celebrating their victory and already composing speeches about their diplomatic success and already rewriting history to make themselves the heroes, and she felt disgust rise in her throat. "They are going to forget," and she said, "and in a generation they will forget what humanity did, and they will forget why humanity left, and they will go back to their comfortable illusions." Yes, and Shadowmere agreed, and then the cycle will begin again, and a new threat will emerge, and the council will be unprepared, and they will look for new protectors, and they will repeat the same mistakes. And this is the nature of soft civilizations, and they cannot learn, because learning would require acknowledging uncomfortable truths. We could go with them, and Lyra said suddenly, and the thought had been growing in her mind for days, and we could join humanity in their isolation, and we could be honest about what we are instead of pretending. The dragon rumbled with approval. "And that is your choice, Rider, and I will follow wherever you lead, but know that if you make this choice, there is no going back, and the council will see it as betrayal, and your people will reject you, I understand." And Lyra said, and I have spent 3 months watching warriors do what was necessary while being hated for it. And I have seen what it costs to protect people who do not want protection, and I cannot go back to the council's comfortable lies. She walked over to Vexthar, and the council chair looked up in surprise. "I am leaving," and Lyra announced, "and I am going to join humanity in their isolation, and I cannot serve a council that refuses to face reality. You cannot." And Vexthar protested, "And you are one of our best officers, and you are needed here." "I am not needed," and Lyra corrected, "and you need warriors who are willing to lie about what they do and who are willing to pretend that violence is clean and necessary. Choices are easy, and I cannot be that person anymore." She turned and walked away, and Shadowmere followed, and his massive form cast shadows across the council delegates, and several moved back in fear, and they had never been comfortable around the dragon, and now they would never have to see him again. Lyra and Maya were preparing to board the human transport when Lyra caught up to them, and Maya turned and surprise showed on her usually controlled face. "I want to join you," and Lyra said without preamble, "and Shadowmere and I want to live among people who are honest about what they are and who do not pretend that survival is clean or easy." Maya studied her for a long moment. "And you understand what you are giving up, and your position and your status and your people, and you will be alone among humans, and we are not easy to live with. I spent 5 years among humans before," and Lyra replied, and I understand what I am choosing, and I watched your people bear the weight of necessary evil for 3 months, and I cannot go back to pretending that weight does not exist." Shadowmere spoke, and his voice resonated in their minds. "The Elf Rider and I have discussed this, and we choose truth over comfort, and we choose honest darkness over comfortable lies, and we will serve as a bridge if ever the time comes when one is needed, but until then, we stand with humanity." Maya looked at both of them, and then slowly nodded. "And welcome then, and to the honest darkness, and to the place where warriors can stop pretending to be anything else, and you will find no parades or celebrations among us, and only hard work and harder choices, and the knowledge that we do what must be done. That is enough." And Lyra said they boarded the transport together, and as the ship departed, Lyra looked back one final time at council space and at the civilization she was leaving behind, and she felt no regret and only relief. Behind them The council delegates continued their celebrations, and already they were forgetting the lessons learned, and already they were returning to their comfortable illusions, and already they were convincing themselves that they had won through diplomacy and wisdom. In the transport, Maya sat beside Lyra, and they watched the stars pass in silence. They will forget. And Maya said quietly, and in a generation they will remember only that we saved them, and they will forget why we left, and they will convince themselves it was our choice, and not theirs, I know. And Lyra replied, and Shadowmere agrees, and he has seen this pattern before. Then why did we help them? And Maya asked, and why did we save people who will hate us for it? Because it was right, and Lyra said, and because the alternative was genocide, and because someone must be willing to bear the, burden, and you chose to be that someone. Maya smiled, and it was tired and sad and true. Welcome to the silent guardians, and she said, and welcome to the warriors who protect from the shadows, and who expect no thanks and receive none, and who do what must be done because no one else will. The human fleet crossed back into their territory, and the defensive barrier sealed behind them, and humanity withdrew once more into isolation and leaving the council to face whatever came next. And in the darkness between stars, the silent guardians prepared, and they trained, and they built, and they watched, and they waited, and they knew that someday another threat would emerge, and someday the council would face something they could not handle. And someday the soft civilizations would fall. But humanity would survive, and because humanity remembered how to be hard, and how to make the choices others refused, and how to bear the weight of necessary darkness. And beside them now stood an elf and her dragon, and they too had learned these lessons, and they too had chosen truth over comfort, and they too would stand ready when the next darkness came. The galaxy continued turning, and civilizations rose and fell, and soft became hard or died, and the cycle repeated endlessly. But some lessons once learned are never forgotten, and some choices once made cannot be unmade, and some warriors once awakened never sleep again. And in the silence between stars the guardians waited and prepared and remembered, because someone must.